Hello friends, my name is JJ. So last December, as 2020 drew to a close, I made a video talking about all of the various things that I believed had been added that year to the American cultural canon. This concept of a cultural canon is sort of hard to precisely define, but it's basically my term for all of the various people, events, objects, and ideas that we can confidently say exist as permanent component parts of American culture. Things that continue to be talked about, referenced, alluded to, or even parodied as pieces of a shared understanding of American life and civilization. The key word being permanent. When we think of what new things to add to the American cultural canon every year, we're not talking about short-lived fads or other things that were briefly important and then quickly forgotten, but rather things that we expect people to still know and talk about potentially decades from now. So, for example, in my 2020 list, I cited the death of Kobe Bryant and the wearing of masks as two things that are likely to loom large in American culture for a long time to come. Another good example would be that cover of National Geographic from 1985 I did a video about the other day. Something people are still making references to nearly 40 years later. Make sense? Great. So now let us get into my list of things from 2021 that I'm willing to predict have successfully made a long-term integration into American culture. So the first one is a bit of a curveball. It is the nation of South Korea. Let me explain. So America is of course a melting pot that over the course of many generations of immigration has absorbed cultural influences from all over the world. But what is a somewhat rarer phenomenon is when a foreign country exerts cultural power over America independent of immigration. Over the last half century, the two most notable examples of this would probably be Great Britain and Japan, both of which have exerted enormous influence over American pop culture, simply because Americans have liked the cultural products that those countries are making, rather than because a lot of Japanese or British people have been moving to America and bringing their culture with them. And I think there is now good reason to believe that South Korea may be fitting into this pattern as well. Korean pop music, or K-pop, has been making steady inroads with young Americans for a while now. In 2019, K-pop was given its own category in that illustrious American institution, the MTV Music Video Awards, making K-pop one of only two culturally specific genres of music recognized by the VMAs after Latin. The K-pop group BTS won the American Music Award for Best Group in 2021, making them the first ever Asian band to win the honor, as well as an even more coveted endorsement from an even more elite American cultural institution, their own special meal at McDonald's. And then of course there was the huge phenomenon of Squid Game, the most successful show in the history of Netflix, and something that completely took over American culture in the latter half of last year. When we consider this achievement in the context of the Korean film Parasite winning Best Picture in 2020, and the enormous success of the series Hellbound, which was released shortly after Squid Game and also broke all sorts of Netflix records, I think it is pretty clear we are looking at a full-fledged phenomenon here. South Korea is a wealthy, industrialized country that in many ways is quite culturally similar to Japan, which, like I said, is a place that exercises a lot of cultural influence over the US these days. But Korean pop culture often strikes me as having a bit more of an edge to it than Japanese stuff, which makes it a bit more compelling, to me at least. But I'd be curious if any one of you guys have your own theory as to why South Korea seems to be flexing as much cultural power as it is over America these days. But it's hard to deny that it is, and that's why I am making the somewhat paradoxical decision to add South Korea to the American cultural canon based on their strong performance in the year 2021. All right, so second thing is NFTs. For those who don't know, NFTs are a kind of internet consumer product / investment property that are quite controversial, but really rose to mainstream attention in the year 2021. In their most common incarnation, NFTs take the form of digital pictures that you can buy and own, often done up in a very particular sort of art style that I have heard described as vape store chic. Now, what exactly it means to own one of these images is a big part of the controversy, since it is very abstract and theoretical and is rooted in the credibility of a new high-concept digital technology that it often seems like no one completely understands. But regardless if you think they're a scam or not, NFTs were everywhere in 2021. In music videos and major art galleries, getting pushed by all manner of brands and celebrities, and of course, making headlines for selling for ungodly amounts of money. They really do seem to be emerging as a leading symbol of the next phase of the internet age, sometimes called Web 3.0. It's sort of like if I was making this video a decade ago, we might be talking about tweets as a leading symbol of Web 2.0. In both cases, you kind of have to take these things seriously, not because they necessarily seem important on their own terms, but just because the community around them has a level of organization and passion that suggests they're not going anywhere. A while ago, there was a good piece in the New Yorker about Bored Apes, which is one of the most famous NFT brands, and the somewhat sympathetic profile did give me personally a bit of pause about the whole phenomena. This idea that despite the lurid way that NFTs are often reported on, there do exist people that engage with them not just as a cynical ploy to make a quick buck flipping, but something that can in fact be a cornerstone of a kind of digital art-based community, which might just be some really expensive make-believe, but hey, there's always been a lot of really expensive make-believe in American culture. All right, now let us talk about two dates that were permanently etched on the American cultural calendar this past year, beginning with June 19th. This is, of course, the day known as Juneteenth, which in 2021 became an official national holiday in the United States to commemorate the liberation of the enslaved Black Americans. It was the first new American holiday since Martin Luther King Jr. Day, nearly 40 years ago. Now, I don't think anybody expects Juneteenth to be the next Christmas or anything. I mean, even 40 years later, I'm not really sure that Martin Luther King Jr. Day has evolved into much more than a symbolic pretext for a lot of stuff to be closed. But still, MLK Day remains a day that everybody knows, and a day that undoubtedly helped consolidate Dr. King's status as one of the major figures of American history, and the civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s as one of its defining chapters. Adopted in this current context of renewed racial reckoning, Juneteenth similarly seems most important as a symbolic acknowledgement that the end of slavery is something as pivotal to the American story as, say, the Declaration of Independence or Christopher Columbus. Which does beg the interesting question of why it took so long, and I don't even mean that in a snarky sense. Like, the end of slavery is a pretty well-known historical event, so it's kind of weird that it took until 2021 to make a holiday about it, don't you think? All right, and then the second day that rose to unique prominence in 2021 was January 6th, the day an angry mob descended on the US Capitol in some sort of frantic effort to prevent Congress from ratifying Joe Biden's election as president. Now, people can and do debate just how big a deal that day was, with positions now entirely determined by partisanship, but at the very least, it was undeniably one of the most sensational and shocking spectacles in modern American political history. The first breach of the Capitol since the War of 1812, as some have put it. It's certainly not hard to imagine this episode getting at least a sidebar in every American history textbook about the 21st century. And when they do, I imagine most of them will use this photo. This fellow, whose real name is Jacob Chansley, but is better known as the QAnon Shaman, seems destined to go down as one of the great iconic weirdos of American history, joining the ranks of men such as Emperor Norton and the John 3:16 guy. If I had to pick a third date that made its way into the American cultural canon, I would go with August 15th. Do you remember what happened on that day? Perhaps not, because in many ways it wasn't just a one-day sort of thing. Anyway, that was the day that the government of Afghanistan was overthrown by the Taliban. American troops then finally left the country for good a few days later on August 30th, thereby officially ending the longest war in the history of the United States. At the time, a lot of people drew analogies between Afghanistan falling to the Taliban and Vietnam falling to the communists in 1975, the latter event being so seared into the American consciousness that there's even a whole Broadway musical about it. Though it was much longer, the Afghanistan war was never as polarizing or traumatizing as Vietnam, but at the same time, its sheer length does make the Taliban victory in 2021 seem similarly destined to serve as one of the great lasting monuments to America's inability to competently shape world events. I think we're even at the place now where just saying the word Afghanistan conjures a certain image of hopelessness, not unlike the word Vietnam. Perhaps it will soon be fashionable to blame things on Afghanistan syndrome as well, in the same way there was about a 20-year period in which basically every foreign policy indecision or failure was blamed on the lingering effects of Vietnam syndrome. All right, now let me just close with a couple of honorable mentions, things that seemed like a big deal in 2021, but I am maybe a little bit less certain if they will necessarily have the same long-term cultural permanence as some of these other things. The first was the Covid-19 vaccine. At one time, I think that many of us thought that getting vaxxed would be this major symbolic moment ushering in the formal end of the COVID pandemic. That doesn't seem to have been the case, given that we are now constantly talking about boosters and vaccine penetrating variants, and the pandemic still seems to have no obvious end in sight. So while getting vaccinated was and still is hugely important, it does seem like the 2021 vaccines will be remembered more as a step in a multifaceted process rather than a single highly sentimentalized event that I think some of us probably expected in 2020. On that note, anti-vaxxers as a movement, and particularly a right-wing movement, gained a lot of prominence this past year as well. Because the anti-vaxxers tend to be so consistently Republican, however, it can be hard to know if they deserve to be treated as an actual discrete movement of any significance, or just one more byproduct of the shallow partisan contrarianism of our age. Simone Biles, the young gymnast, was a subject of huge attention at the Tokyo 2021 Olympics, even though she didn't win any gold medals and many fewer medals overall than she won in Rio in 2016. But that was, of course, because she made the striking decision to abandon the games just 4 days in because she thought they were taking too much of a toll on her mental health. This was heralded as a brave but controversial decision, and the sort of thing that could make her a major activist figure in years to come, but it kind of feels too early to tell. She has yet to formally confirm that she is even completely done with competing, for instance. I feel the same way about Lil Nasex. This was a big year for him as a major figure in American pop culture, with 2 #1 singles, both of which had extremely viral music videos as well, plus that whole controversy with the Satan shoes that really helped put him on the map as a culture war provocateur. So was this the year he officially became too big to ignore? Or was it just the peak year of a celebrity with a narrow novelty appeal that won't last long? I'll leave it to people who know more than me about pop stars to answer that one. And on that note, let me now turn the tables and ask you what you think were the people, events, properties, or things of 2021 that you feel are destined to earn a permanent place in the American cultural canon. 40 years from now, what 2021 things will they still be making jokes about on The Simpsons, which I assume will still be on? Let me know in the comments. Happy 2022, and I will see you all next week.